Hopefully many of you already are familiar with East Bay Housing Organizations, or EBHO, but I want to share a little more about who we are. Since 1984, EBHO has worked with our members to create, preserve, and protect affordable housing opportunities for low-income communities in the East Bay by advocating, organizing, educating, and building coalitions. We believe that communities are healthiest and most powerful when we have quality, affordable homes for all, and when those most affected by the housing crisis can shape their own futures. This year, we're celebrating our 25th annual Affordable Housing Month to call attention to the many dimensions of the housing affordability crisis, to lift up solutions and celebrate our wins. By being here, you're joining hundreds of people around Alameda and Contra Costa counties at 13 events taking place this month. I encourage you to take a look at the calendar, which is being shared now in the chat, to see what else is happening in May. All of our events are free and virtual. Today, we're here to learn, but EBHO believes in learning in service of powerful action. So we're excited to announce that we're about to release our new online study room. The study room will serve as an educational resource for our members, supporters, and members of the public at large. It will showcase what affordable homes in the East Bay look like, what residents have to say about their communities, and what we can all do together to create the just, thriving communities that we need. If you don't already get our emails, please sign up using the link in the chat to receive the announcement once the study room is launched. And finally, we invite you to become an EBHO member if you're not already. With your support, our collective impact grows. Together, we can create an East Bay where everyone is housed and lives in beloved community. So if you're interested, please check out the information being shared in the chat. And before I move us on, I just want to share one other thing. The East Bay, this place that is in the name of East Bay Housing Organizations and the place where most of us live, work, and fight to make sure that everyone has a home, this is the unceded territory of the Lisjan Ohlone people and the original homeland of the Ohlone, Bay Miwok, and Delta Yokuts peoples. So why do I mention this? This historical and ongoing reality matters for all of our work. The injustices in our housing system, injustices that we're going to talk about today, including housing insecurity, displacement, and homelessness, they all reside on top of a foundation of colonization. So, in order to truly advance housing justice, our movement and our organizations must strive to support Indigenous-led efforts to repair the ongoing harms of colonialism here in the East Bay. In that spirit, EBHO is in the process of paying Shumi, a land tax that supports the work of the Segorete Land Trust, which returns Lisjan Ohlone land to Lisjan Ohlone people. And we'll be engaging with our members and our supporters later this year to encourage you all to do the same. So please stay tuned. And with that, I'd like to pass it to EBHO's Executive Director, Gloria Bruce.
Thank you so very much, Alex. Really just appreciate all the work you've done, not just to bring us together today, but in Contra Costa throughout your time with us here at EBHO. And I'm so excited to see over 40 people in the room, and growing every minute, to hear from these fabulous panelists. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and then we're going to have Christy Laughlin frame things for us this afternoon, and then we'll talk with our three panelists for a while. And then, as Alex mentioned, we should have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A, and we definitely want to hear from you during that. I know I see a number of you who have been involved with EBHO's work in Contra Costa for years. I see Michael Glickson, I see Lori Goss, I see William Goodwin. So we've been involved in the county for quite some time, but we really wanted to just spotlight the work and talk about what's different about Contra Costa County, which is not just one thing, right, of course. What's the same as working anywhere in the Bay Area? And what do we need to do together to advance housing justice from Richmond to Antioch, Walnut Creek, Martinez, Concord, everywhere in between? So this is what this is all about. Your guides on this conversation, I'm so excited. I've worked with them all before. They're really awesome folks. First, we have, in alphabetical order, we have Woody Carp, who's a former senior project manager for Eden Housing. He has overseen and built affordable housing all over the region, but a number of projects in Contra Costa where he is also a resident, and he's also an EBHO board member. So we're so glad to have Woody sharing his perspective today. We have Christy Laughlin, who is the Senior Campaign Director for Contra Costa at the East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy, or EBASE. EBASE has been a partner of ours for many years, and Christy has just been tireless, whether she's working on issues for worker justice, immigrant justice, housing justice. She is just out there all the time, and we're so honored to work with her, and you'll hear from her first. LaVonna Martin, who has for many years headed up the Department of Health, Housing, and Homeless Services in Contra Costa County. That's just a few things to manage, and she does it so well. LaVonna just has a stellar reputation for her and her team coming out here every day and addressing what sometimes people don't think is a big deal in Contra Costa, but absolutely is. There are many people who are unhoused, many people who are economically facing economic instability, and LaVonna is doing everything she can to marshal public resources to help those folks. And then last but definitely not least, Nicole Zapata, who also is with EBASE. She is the Contra Costa and Concord tenant organizer, and even during this pandemic, Nicole has been out there quite literally assisting tenants who are facing eviction, showing up every day on the front lines. And so we're so honored to have Nicole with us here as well. So with that, I'm going to go to Christy, and we're going to hear from her for a few minutes just to talk to us about what's the deal with Contra Costa. Tell us, Christy, what do we need to know to navigate this conversation?
Well, thank you so much for having me here as part of this conversation. I'm honored to be and our colleagues, and I think that it's good to be all in dialogue right now to face our future for housing justice. I think my role is just to offer a few my own experiences or insights about the landscape we're working in Contra Costa. And I offer them humbly because I know many have been working for many more years. But I do think, coming from having worked also for worker justice and immigrant justice and housing justice for 25 years also in other counties, also helps bring to light what some of the unique contours of the Contra Costa landscape are. So I just want to say I offer those as part of our experience over the last 6 years, convening the Raise the Roof Coalition, a coalition of 11 faith, labor, and community organizations who really believe that every person should have a feeling of belonging and place and affordable housing with respect and dignity in Contra Costa. We've been doing a lot of our work fighting for tenant protections over the last 6 years, largely in Concord, but also because of the pandemic have done a lot of advocacy at the county level. So I want to say our coalition has focused on protections, keeping tenants from losing their homes in the first place. We understand it'll take a multi-pronged approach, which I think this panel represents. We all talk about the 3 Ps, having protections, preservation of housing, and production. But from our vantage point, that focusing on protections is key and critical, and it's about doing immediate triage. And in fact, I like to call that P prevention, because we very much see our work keeping tenants housed and stopping homelessness as prevention. So that kind of just leads me, that background, to some of the observations that I have is really, we too often, I think in Contra Costa, the first observation is that we deal sometimes with homelessness and this housing crisis as siloed issues, as 2 separate issues. I don't know if any of you saw the East Bay Times article today that titled "Bay Area is Fed Up with Homelessness, but Interest in Housing is Flagging." That was just too perfect for, I think, sometimes revealing that these issues are siloed. I think more so, I think, in this county, and we need to probably help bridge that divide. I also think we need to be in more spaces like this one, where there's more integration of folks doing working with homeless, and those advocates and those organizing to come up with more creative, cohesive policies and avenues forward. I think the second observation, I think doing this work, which is really ambitious for housing justice, is we need a more developed culture of organizing and infrastructure in the county. I think that's my observation also coming from Alameda. where I didn't realize the very rich history of organizing from that really cultivated a rich ecosystem of organizing from, or way back, the Black Panthers left their legacy, the free speech movement, women's rights movements, union movements. And I think in crisis, we see the fruits of that legacy of organizing. And especially in some of the COVID response, that we've seen a more integrated, holistic approach in other counties that have that more developed ecosystem. And why do we need organizing? Well, that's related to my third observation is there is really truly an outsized influence of the real estate lobby groups at the state and the local level, like the California Apartment Association and the California Association of Realtors, that are really influencing, I think, public policy and responses to this housing crisis in a very immediate and direct way at the state level, but also at the local level. We've seen this on the ground, say in Concord, when many of our efforts have been thwarted, fighting for tenant protections to keep people housed. And they, a lot of the electeds are candid that there's kind of an open door policy for the lobbyists, but many of us advocates have to fight to get meetings and to keep informed of what's going on. And really this issue of housing we need to contest power for power, and that requires more organizing infrastructure. And then I think really importantly in this context, we've seen all over this country, but definitely true in Contra Costa is my fourth observation is that there's no real reckoning with the history and ongoing legacy of racism and segregation that has helped cause and shape this housing crisis. And this really needs to be at the forefront of how we analyze and understand the problem in order to pave a path toward housing justice. We all know that segregation has shaped many of our communities. They've been shaped by white flight, actually, in Contra Costa, from Oakland, from Richmond, from Berkeley, decades ago. And this influences what has happened with segregation and who's in crisis. So we need to attend to that. And then fifth, I want to share, which is related to the fourth, my observation in Contra Costa, is often we confront a kind of provincialism, but often that is embedded in that is a racial bias. We like this, many of our cities I've worked in like their small town flavor and local identity, but aren't examining sometimes the coded language for what that means about racial bias. We've seen that even when seeking policy solutions at local levels, they don't want to hear the policies from places like Richmond or Oakland. And they're sure you can couch that in an urban divide, but often we've seen that really what they're saying is, we're not those communities. So we have to be attentive to that and expose that and confront those in order to have solutions that actually don't replicate those kind of hidden biases. So that's, I think, some of the challenges I see on the landscape that we're all navigating with this issue of housing. But I also think it's in a super exciting moment and we're really, this is a right moment, I think. I noticed the big change over 6 years, even in Contra Costa. Certainly in the last years, we've seen more consciousness and focus on systemic racism. And we are ripe to bring that here in Contra Costa. And I think we've all seen that over this past year. And then I think with COVID, I think there's a new sensibility maybe of how we can go above and beyond to create a safety net. And there's more talk of a safety net, and it's our job to really put housing front and center of understanding that that is the most critical safety net that we can provide is stable, affordable, accessible housing. So I'll leave it there and let you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christy. I'm ending on that housing as safety net. Yes, housing as infrastructure, housing as everything. So thank you for breaking that all down. I heard a lot that I'm sure our panelists are going to want to dig into. And I want to highlight that point you said of all these challenges, but also there's a lot of excitement and momentum and organizing and forward progress in the county right now. And all of the trends that are happening anywhere in the Bay Area are happening somewhere in Contra Costa. And let's also be mindful too, there are some generalizations that we don't want to generalize the county too much. Supervisor John Joya, who a lot of us have worked with in the west part of the county, he says in his mind, there are really 4 Contra Costas. You have 4 different regions like East, West, Central, at least, that are quite different politically and everything else. So there's a lot going on there. So with that, I want to, as our panelists are getting spotlighted and coming on, I'd like them to start with whoever would like to go first. What do you think of what Christy just shared with us? What do you think of some of these ideas of the differences in organizing capacity, or any responses to that? And let's see, we've got Woody spotlighted, Lavana, and we'll have Nicole in a minute, but anyone who'd like to jump in first, go ahead and unmute.
I can start.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christy, for grounding us all in that. I think a lot of, if not, I think everything resonated with me. I think overall, I really agree with Christy's assessment of Contra Costa being an area that has historically lacked and continues to lack real organizing capacity. Just personally for me, growing up in the county, I actually didn't know what organizing was. And even when I did learn what it was and how to do it later on in high school and college, I didn't think that Contra Costa was a place that was organizing. I thought, oh, that's reserved for places like Oakland or San Francisco. And so even my own organizing didn't start in the county until I started working at EBHO a few years ago. And so I always remember that because I remember it stuck out to me looking at this opportunity, because prior to that, I had been organizing in San Francisco, Oakland, or San Jose. And I think what I have seen is, while there are a lot of nonprofit organizations doing more of the direct service work in the county, that hasn't always translated to that deeper organizing and advocacy. While I think, we definitely need direct service work, we need both the long term and short term. I think that, the work that we've been trying to figure out is how to merge those two things together so that we can all, work towards this collective vision where, people can be housed long term. So I don't think it needs to be, siloed in that way where, some folks do the direct service, some folks do organizing. I think we've been our work has been really centered on how to bring folks together. And I think just one last note, something about I think it was near the end, Christy mentioned, the history of racism in the county. And I definitely have seen and felt how that does translate to a more conservative county. And then at the same time, I think about moments when you have folks from all over the county coming together to advocate for things like, defunding the sheriff, for example, and investing in things like housing. And you're hearing from all over the county that this is something we want. And then you have all the elected officials saying no, And so I think sometimes we can think, the county is just, a blanket statement is very conservative, but I think there's something there where even sometimes those in power are more conservative than their constituents. And so how do we, build that power to fight back against these injustices when we know that we can reach people, we just have to build that power.
So well said, thank you. We can reach people, we just have to build our power. Absolutely. Woody, you look like you want to jump in, go for it.
So I think Nicole said some really insightful things. I really do understand that organizing in Contra Costa has really never taken off in a robust way like it has in Alameda County or in San Francisco. And one of the things that I've noticed of working in Contra Costa over the years, and for people's benefit, I have been a project developer for a nonprofit for about 20 years and have built in Alameda, Contra Costa, Solano, Santa Clara, and it's all over the greater Bay Area. And throughout it all, I think that the one thing that is absolutely clear is that everybody in every one of those communities cares deeply about their own communities. So when it comes to building affordable housing, everything becomes local. And if you can speak to people on a local level, you're going to have an impact. You're either going to get support or you're going to get opposition to a project that you may want to build. So recognizing that and reaching out to communities early on in a process has always been critical to the success of a project. And keeping the community informed during the course of the project is also essential. That is success in terms of bringing forward affordable housing. It would also be true for market rate housing as well. I think that it's essential to recognize that communities really care, whether it's the most affluent communities or the communities that are struggling. Everybody cares about their own neighborhoods. So, and specifically what you highlighted, or John Joya highlighted about Contra Costa County, is that it is very, very diverse. There are very different needs between West County and Far East County and the Central County. Everybody has a completely different perspective on it. So recognizing that, and I think that's probably the single greatest challenge to organizing and to get funding that we all need to develop housing and to provide services throughout, because everybody's perspective is different. And so trying to find a way to coalesce those very divergent interests is the challenge of Contra Costa County. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure that I have a lot more I can talk about on this subject, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Woody. And thanks I really appreciate how you point out, everybody cares about their community. So let's keep that in mind, even though their way that they care about it might be different than how we feel about it. But let's start with, how do we enlist people's care for their community in a way that brings other people in and isn't just about them holding on to what they've got, right? So thank you for bringing that. Lavana, what do you have to say?
Well, I really wanted to, this is going to sound like I'm just part of the chorus here, but I do appreciate, Nicole and Kristen's sort of observations around, the lack of organizing compared to other perhaps communities. I started my career in San Francisco, and there is a much broader coalition of advocates and organizers over there. But I've been in Contra Costa now for 20 years working in this field, and I have most certainly seen the number of advocacy groups growing. And so I think, for me, that gives me hope that we have a growing number of residents and advocates who are beginning to organize. Those voices are so critical to the work I do, and really just important to, I think, remember that, that power really is held with the people. And so it's not just sort of electeds having the ability to do what they want, but really I've seen a shift around, understanding that if we're not happy with our elected officials at the city level or at the county level, that there is power to change that. And we have a number of nonprofit, and I'm not suggesting that, but I am saying that, we have a number of nonprofit organizations that are out there. And so I don't think it's the lack of capacity, as Nicole was saying, around the number of nonprofits, but how do we build capacity there so that it's how do we helping translate that experience and providing direct services and working with persons with lived experience, right? And how do we translate that and elevate and amplify their voices? And I think that's where I've seen some shift over a few years, and some real wonderful mentoring and capacity building happening so that we can hear those voices.
That's amazing. Thank you. And I think what I'm going to do now, there was one other question I was going to ask all three of you about sort of what are the unique opportunities and challenges in the county. But I think because I want to give you each space to expand a little more on your particular areas, I'm gonna move right to asking you each questions, and also say that I think as you all just started to outline some of the things that are unique barriers and unique opportunities, and also to say some of the things that we see or that Christy outlined about Contra Costa, which made me seem more pronounced in the county, such as a lack of a reckoning with the history of racial injustice. Full disclosure, I live in Alameda County, and I don't go to a lot of hearings where I'm like, this city has truly reckoned with their history of racial injustice. So I think like we all have a long way to go on that for sure, right? But there's probably still some unique constituencies that we need to mobilize in this county. So on that end, thinking about that, I want to bring specific questions to each of you to kind of expand more on barriers or opportunities in your area. So we're going to go backwards. So Lavana, I'm actually going to start with you. And one thing that I think a lot of people have in their minds is that poverty, houselessness, homelessness, these are urban issues. They don't play out in suburban communities. They certainly don't play out in ex-urban communities. We know that that's not at all the case. And so can you talk to us about what does economic instability and houselessness, what does it look like in Contra Costa County, and how are your departments and your partners designing solutions around that?
Well, I most certainly think that particularly our East Contra Costa cities, which is, more suburban veteran communities, would most certainly say that these are not urban problems, right? That the growing number of individuals experiencing homelessness in our community has really just grown. And not just those persons who are now unhoused, but who are unhoused and actually unsheltered, living on the streets. We are seeing those numbers continue to grow. East Contra Costa, particularly when we're thinking about sort of suburban homelessness, it saw its sharpest increase in unsheltered homelessness in 2016, right? And I think that it grew by 30% in just over, a couple of years. And I think sort of that rapid growth was surprising and shocking, and left particularly our East County region trying to very quickly think about how do we bring in the resources necessary to address housing and homelessness in the community. And as looking at particularly unsheltered homelessness today, those numbers have remained steady, particularly in our suburban communities. It hasn't changed. And what has shifted, though, across the county is really the number of individuals who are sleeping now in their RVs and their vehicles, right? And I think we see that. And I think that's even exacerbated now as we are coming out of the pandemic, that we have seen almost a 20% increase in individuals actually living in their RVs and their vehicles, and that is something that is really paramount. I think that we must address and not lose some of the gains that we have made, particularly during this really difficult time, the pandemic. We very quickly were able to think through how do we get through some of the issues that we traditionally face, right? The NIMBYism, the different political will and interest and tolerances of various cities. around opening shelters and services, that really just was minimized as everyone focused on housing as a health issue, which personally is what I've always seen homelessness and housing, that it is a critical health issue. And I think the pandemic allowed us to think of it clearly, more clearly in those terms, and allow the community to see it as really health and safety, and push through some of the things that traditionally bog us down. And I think the challenge is, how do we, maintain some of those gains? How do we retain that in our system of care? And the work that my division is currently engaged in with a lot of our community partners is figuring out, how do we do this quickly, perhaps a little differently, honoring really what our consumers are saying they've always wanted, with more dignity in housing. How do we do that? In the conversations leading up to this for the last 3 years, I'd say these have just been conversations and trying to figure out how to do it. And through the pandemic, we were able to break through that so quickly. So, I think the work, as you were asking, sort of how, does my division in our community, like, how are we designing solutions for sort of what's next? It really is, how do we continue to capitalize on some of those opportunities to bring people outside, inside, and that's through the acquisition of hotels. We were able to acquire a hotel, 174 room hotel in our East County region in a matter of 4 months, which is just inconceivable as I say it, but it was done in a matter of 4 months. And that really required, I think, obviously the political support. But I do think sort of the reframing around homelessness as a health issue helped us make those gains. And so we need to continue to look at, do we look at purchasing more hotels, but not losing sight that we and everyone should have a permanent home. We cannot think that moving someone into a hotel is just it. And I think that's really the next challenge we're going to have with our perhaps the community and the advocate and some of our really community members and advocates who are advocating for opening these hotels and bringing people inside, but feeling like perhaps, great, it's over, right? We've gotten people under a roof and 4 walls, but we need to make sure that they have a safe, permanent place to do that. So our work ahead is really establishing and continuing to grow our permanent housing, including permanent supported housing opportunities. And that's housing with services, right? How do we continue to grow those in our community as well? And that is a laser focus on continuing developing. And I know Woody's heard this many a times, but as we think about affordable housing, we really do need to think about affordable housing, right? To make it affordable for everyone, right? And that there's not just a standard of what affordability is, what you think, that's different for everyone. And it's a very subjective thing. And it means one thing in the housing world, but another thing for others who are extremely low income and may have a median income of $2,500 a month, but can't afford rent, right? That is 94% of their monthly income in Contra Costa. That's inconceivable. We really need extremely low, affordable housing at 30% or lower of the area median income. So, I think that's our work next, and working with, former developers like, Woody and, the wonderful developers of Eden and everyone else out there to figure out how we do this and acquire those units at the lowest income levels.
Yes, Thank you, Lavana. That's great. So, that's a good segue then. So I'm going to go actually back to Woody, since you were mentioned several times and your kind of work was mentioned. So Woody, as a longtime resident and developer of affordable homes in the county, how have you seen local attitudes change regarding affordable housing over the years? And where do you think resistance still lies? And how can that be addressed so that we can get to building this really low income housing that Lavana is speaking about? You're on mute, Woody.
All right. Sorry. I don't think attitudes in Contra Costa County have changed substantially over the years. As I said before, I think that attitudes are very local. People are very protective of what they have. And one of the things that has been unique about Contra Costa County is that historically, it has been a county that has served, working class, moderate income households. As you go out into central Contra Costa County, you see a lot of modest single family homes and very, very few multifamily developments. So, and communities have organized around that concept. They've organized around the concept that you could theoretically buy a moderate home and have that American dream. And I think counties have clung, this county, Contra Costa County, has clung to that belief system. I think that the ship has kind of sailed because the affordability levels of single family homes in Contra Costa County have skyrocketed and continue to skyrocket well beyond what is truly affordable for young people starting out, for people who have decent blue collar jobs, and certainly it has not left any door open for people of the lowest income levels. So I think Contra Costa County is kind of at a crossroads in that regard, where I think organizing and education about the extreme high cost of housing is critical. I think that with that, I think that we can start to get communities, especially along the BART line or along high transit corridors, to accept higher density. And higher density is the opportunity for multifamily buildings and more affordable housing. And in terms of affordable housing, the only way that we can get to what Lavana was speaking to, which is to be inclusive for people who are at or below 20% of the area median income, you need to mix those units into buildings that have that rent to people at higher levels. And you can go and stagger it. And that's what all of the nonprofits do. They try to stagger the income levels of the people. So they say, we're going to rent some units at 20%, and some units at 30, and some units at 50, and some units at 60, and some units as high as 80% AMI. I mean, just so you get a sense of what that really means, the current income limits, for a single person at 100% of the area median income, meaning that's what the average income is for Contra Costa County. So a single person, the AMI level is $91,400. So, and for a family of four, that it's $130,500. So when you say, okay, if you're at the 20% AMI level, that means that person needs to earn $18,280. Now, they're the homeless folks are not pulling in $18,000, but and at 50%, it's a single person's got to make 45,000. These are, it's a very high bar for people to achieve. So affordable housing developers recognize that the only way they can make a project work and is to bring in a number of units at that very low level and a number of units at the very high level, and the bulk of them right in the middle. And that's sort of the secret sauce that we do in order to have the project be able to function. So I started to say it begins with education and organizing, and then it's a recognition of getting them to the communities to understand that they have to do their fair share, and to understand that they have to give way to the notion of having just a 2 or a 3-story building with just a few units in it, but to really have a 4, 5, 7-story building in their community that is going to serve 100 to 150 units. And then you've got the economies of scale that would allow us to serve people at the lowest level and also the middle level, which is still very low for the county. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but there we go. Now you're on mute.
Sorry, you answered my question and probably many others, Woody. That was great. So I'm going to turn it to Nicole for our last response before we have hopefully time for 1 or 2 questions. I see we've got a couple in the chat already. I can tell that Lori Michelle Goss is just bursting for what I'm going to ask you all. Lightning round at the very end. Think of it now. I'm going to ask you at the end for 30 or 45 seconds on how do we change this? Who do we engage? So think about that. If you have one recommendation for action for people to take away at the end, let's talk about that. But first, Nicole, let's switch gears a little bit from this really important nuts and bolts about affordable housing development to one of the populations that's so often disproportionately impacted. Immigrants are often at the center of housing instability and advocacy. What are some of the ways that immigrants are disproportionately impacted by housing injustices, and what solutions are low-income tenants and their allies calling for?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think the intersection between immigrant justice and housing justice is really key in my work, and it doesn't always get talked about. So thank you for asking this. I think during the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, we've just seen an increase since COVID. A lot of immigrant communities were hit. The first ones hit with job loss, for example. Working in the service sector, and so what we began to see was a lot of harassment, or an increase in harassment, because it was definitely happening before the pandemic. Landlords taking advantage of people's vulnerable status to silence them or threaten them to stay in these really unhealthy or unstable living conditions. We've had story after story of tenants saying that they were threatened with deportation when they spoke up about their rights, whether it was asking for a repair or, speaking up about a rent increase or eviction notice, or they were actually served an eviction notice after, they spoke up. And so a lot of times, immigrants' vulnerable status is what allows some landlords to take advantage. And while this is technically illegal, we know, this harassment's illegal. Unfortunately, there's no real enforcement measures when it comes to stopping harassment. It's really hard to prove. You know, a lot of times getting access to legal help it's not accessible. And so I would say, yeah, harassment's probably number one. And then beyond that, I guess even like little things, or not so little things, but when it comes to even finding housing, for example, all the requirements you need to be eligible, like first and last month rent and the deposit, you know, especially during the pandemic when people are still being evicted, regardless of the moratorium, people just really don't have that money set aside to find housing. And so we had a tenant recently who I'm sure some of you have heard of his story, but Manuel was evicted after not being able to pay rent. The landlord used a loophole in the moratorium to legally evict. So it was a legal eviction. And it was really hard for Manuel and his family to find housing because of all these things. And, you know, I was being emailed a bunch of resources like vouchers, but all of this required a legal status or some form of residency that they didn't have. And so it's like, as much as that's well-meaning, and I appreciate all the resources that people have shared, it's been really hard because I have to just turn it away and just explain that Manuel's family does not qualify. And I think, you know, so just thinking about the solutions, I guess, you know, Christy had mentioned that we've been fighting for over 5 years now for permanent tenant protections. So, you know, we haven't been able to win things like local just cause for evictions and rent control on a city level in Concord. I would say our first real policy win was probably the county and Concord moratoriums during the pandemic, which definitely is needed, and we still need an extension on those things. But I think thinking beyond, like what Lavana was saying, we need to keep people housed long term, and everyone needs a home, a stable home. And so I think that definitely includes this, the protection piece, which is preventing, I think, homelessness down the road. So I would say, yeah, permanent tenant protections, closing the loopholes on the eviction moratorium so that people like Manuel won't be evicted during a pandemic. And with the harassment piece, I know that there's some cities like Long Beach, I think, won an anti-harassment policy that was really strong and that actually had teeth to it. Like I said, I feel like current anti-harassment laws aren't strong enough, you know, no enforcement measures. So and I think that I think it's Richmond that is currently exploring pursuing an anti-harassment policy as well. And I think one last solution, I think a lot of people are talking about the rental assistance funds that are coming through the state for folks who have been affected by COVID. And a lot of landlords are actually taking away or turning away the offer. And there's no current way to address that in the law, in the state law. And so I know that folks, advocates across the state are coming together to figure out how to not only demand an extension on the moratorium, but also figure out how do we kind of close those gaps so that people can actually take advantage of the rental assistance money. And then address that debt that people are in, because I would say that after the harassment piece, the debt is really the biggest piece that a lot of the immigrant communities are dealing with.
That's huge. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's really, thanks for looking at all those, and so much work to do. And we have some information on our website about rental assistance programs, and we did a webinar on that before. So that's something that Alex, Nicole, and many others in the Raise the Roof Coalition have been working on. So time really flies when you're digging in deep. I think we will only have time, unfortunately, for one of the questions that got put in the chat, and I think Christy's going to join us back on Spotlight. But what I'm going to do is, with all those problems that were just mentioned, we do have one we have a resource that's come through thanks to organizing and voting, which is Measure X, which is a sales tax that passed last November in the county, thanks to the efforts of many of you who are on this call. And Doug Leach, EBHO member, Million Hats in Contra Costa, has asked, what is at the top of our list for housing and homelessness needs that we need to propose to the county to spend those sales tax revenues? So I'm going to see if any of our panelists have some quick responses to what's on your Measure X wish list very quickly.
So I'm going to
go ahead.
Lavana.
Woody then Lavana.
I will. Oh, I was going to always defer to Lavana.
Either way.
All right, I'll go. I'm gonna tell you that in order for affordable housing to be successful, it is critical that we get local funding. And so Measure X provides an unbelievable opportunity to provide that local funding that can be, if it is committed to a project before we apply for tax credits, with tax credits being the primary source of funds that we use to develop permanent affordable housing, it would make us competitive. So Measure X, it should be allocated to each locality, and the locality could then commit those dollars to a project that would be a long-term commitment, because it takes a while to get tax credits. It's nothing that happens overnight, but that would be that gap funding that would allow us to be competitive.
Yeah, I completely.
What do you think, Lavana?
I completely agree with that, Woody. And as that's sort of a long-term, right? The wonderful thing about Measure X is now it's an ongoing permanent revenue source, right? So that's one of the things that I am really excited about. And so as we look to, perhaps utilizing it the way Woody suggested to help projects get off the ground, which is so important. There are some short-term things that, oftentimes we don't have flexible dollars to utilize, right? So things like the interim housing that we just talked about, oftentimes ongoing dollars are what we need most. And so as we are sitting and watching the state push down a few additional dollars for capital projects, that's fantastic, but you can't take advantage of it if you don't have the ability to pay for the services once the building is there. So I really think it's important to think about those projects in development, right? So sort of the perhaps wish list that Woody's thinking about, and what services might be needed within those affordable housing, so that you can serve those individuals who need those additional supports in order to remain housed. How do we look for those ongoing dollars, as well as those ongoing dollars just to get some of the rapid interim housing, right, interventions going now? And I have a full list of those opportunities. So anyone can pick my brain later on that.
I have never known someone working in public service to not have a full wish list of what they would do with more resources. So I love that, Lavana, and feel free to throw some of those in the chat if you want. All right, so we have reached the promise for lightning round, and I'm going to ask if Christy can be spotlighted too, because I want to get Christy's 30 seconds on this. So we've got a couple people in the chat who are like, I'm picturing this like it's on Twitter with like a clap emoji after every word. What can we do? So I want to give you each 30 seconds or so to say, we got 50 people here who are raring to go and do something, to mobilize a constituent, to talk to the supervisors, give them a suggestion. So whoever wants to go first, and when we run out of time, I'm going to throw a little emoji up on my thing being like, that's lovely, I love you, there's a heart, please wrap it up. So who wants to go first? What can we do?
Talk to your local city manager and talk to the city council, educate them on the need for housing in their community. recommend to them that they reach out to local nonprofits and tour local nonprofits. Go on those tours yourself. The nonprofits are more than happy to showcase their properties, and they will be convinced that they're not the devil in their community, because they are high quality, they are service enhanced buildings, and they are really, really a positive for every community.
Thank you, Woody. Great modeling. Who's next as we wrap up?
I'll jump in.
Christy, what can we do?
So agree with Lavana on interim housing. So people like Manuel, who were getting kicked out, whether they should or shouldn't have an immediate place to go. I would say, let's stop the exploitation of certain populations and the abuses, take that out of the system and get more tenant defense and legal services that's permanently available in Contra Costa to help stop that abuse. I would say also we have to confront the market, and stop taking some properties off the market through preservation and dollars to invest in land trusts and having cities available to take over buildings, because we are dancing around this whole issue, right, of housing as a commodity for the highest bidder, and we need to confront that.
Thank you, Christy. Nicole, how about you? What can we do?
I mean, not to add, yeah, I echo what Christy and Woody have shared. So in terms of sharing something new, I think, I guess talking, not only to the people who are in power, but also your neighbors, because I think at the end of the day, we tend to kind of, isolate ourselves. And I think a lot of my work has been around literally getting folks together, even when we don't have the laws maybe on our side. And so I think that's what I can offer, is like the power of building that community, because we can build that strong community and fight back together, but we have to talk to each other first, right? So I think definitely talking and educating your neighbors.
So important. Actually talking to each other. Yes. Lavana, take us home.
I'm not sure there's really much more that I can add. We have a lot of like-minded individuals, I think, on this call, and to Nicole's point, thinking about maybe those who aren't like-minded and how do we reach out to our neighbors and start that dialogue, right? Because it doesn't help to continue to preach to the choir, that in order to build sort of that coalition, we need to really think about those who think perhaps differently and start that conversation and dialogue as well.
I love it. I mean, I love preaching to the choir, love singing to the choir. It's fun, but it's not what moves us. So choir, thank you for giving us a couple of extra minutes of your time this afternoon. Please throw those little hand clap emojis in the chat for our panelists, Woody, Lavana, Christy, Nicole. Thank you so much. Thank you to the EBHO team. Thank you for Alex for organizing us. We'll see you at other Affordable Housing Month events. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.